So much. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself, and then Sabia will introduce herself and take it away. Just the one thing I wanted to mention before we get started is just feel free to ask any questions that you have during the session in the chat if they are things that we could address like pretty quickly if you're just looking for clarification or for us to repeat something. If you have more involved questions, then I encourage you to use the Q&A feature to just have that on stack for us to address once we're done with the presentation. I don't want to discourage anyone from asking or conversing during the course of the presentation, but it'll just be, I think, easier to organize that information via the Q&A feature if it's going to be something more involved or that something you might want to just like share yourself. We can invite you to speak as well during the Q&A session. Sorry, my name is Zoa Khalili. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Southern California and I'm a staff attorney at Palestine Legal. I am really happy to see some familiar names, and I am really grateful for all the work that you all are doing to draw attention to the issue of Palestine, as well as other justice work that you all are doing and education for our communities. I'm so grateful for all the labor you guys are putting into this issue and other issues of importance.
Thanks, Soha. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabia Ahmed. I'm a staff attorney at PAL Legal, and I'm also really excited to be here with you all today. I'm coming from the East Coast, so I'm based in New Hampshire, but I come from New York. And yeah, so let's get started. And like Zoha said, you can put questions that you have in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on it if it's something we can like answer quickly during the presentation. Okay, so Zoha, do you want to share the presentation? Thank you. Okay. So this is a Know Your Rights workshop, and what that means is that we hope through this conversation that we can inform activists like yourself that are doing the important work about how to protect yourselves and also how to move forward with regards to using the law as a vehicle and as a limit. So today's goals, just want to give you a sense of like what we're hoping to accomplish today. We're hoping to give you a picture of what the law is, so that you know how to be your own attorney. And our solidarity movement is one that's rooted in the distribution of knowledge and a rejection of traditional legal systems that require the masses to depend on a few to understand and use the law. So what we're trying to do with this presentation is to append that and to challenge that status quo and offer pointers on how you can defend yourself and to move forward. And as always, you can reach out to Palestine Legal for assistance. So just to read through the goals that you see here, we want to alert you to the legal landscape and the ways in which it might intersect with your activism, help you assess the risks and how to mitigate that, and also to boost your activism.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the unmute button. So I just wanted to include a bit of a disclaimer here where, we're trying to share information here, but even though Sabia and I are both attorneys, we don't have an attorney-client relationship here. And so the information that you share, just being mindful of the fact that it's being recorded and could potentially be shared. I think once we turn off the recording, I think it's a bit of a more secure space for people, but just to just be aware that like this session is not necessarily confidential, and so you shouldn't share any information that you don't want others to be aware of, and it's not going to be a confidential space. But if people do have like one-on-one questions that they want to share with us confidentially, that you guys should reach out to us via our website. I know there's a question in the chat about what Palestine Legal is, and I guess we should have addressed that already. But we are a legal organization that provides support to the Palestine Solidarity Movement. We do have like a particular range of expertise and a limited staff capacity. And so like the nature of our role has really shifted over the past few months with the huge influx of need for legal support. And so one thing that we're doing a lot more now than we had in the past is referring out cases to other attorneys and really cultivating an attorney network of support for Palestine activists who need legal representation. And particularly in the realm of employment law, which is, I think, pretty relevant here. That is something that is a specialized area of law that varies state by state. And so we are trying to connect with employment attorneys across the country to be able to provide local support to people. And so we are mainly generalists. We provide support largely around free speech and First Amendment issues and a lot of the other issues that we're going to be covering in this presentation. We are a nonprofit, and so we don't charge for our services, but depending on the attorneys that we're referring out to, they may need to charge for their time in order to be able to provide legal support and also have a roof over their heads. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that like while we provide support free of charge, that we might not necessarily be able to find you legal representation free of charge. The other thing that we do is we collect information around the attacks faced by the Palestine Solidarity Movement, both in order to share that information out with our base and with reporters and with decision makers, and to do policy advocacy around that, and also to build connections between activists across the country that are facing similar struggles. So a lot of the stuff that we cover in this presentation is going to be really the meat and potatoes of our work. But if people have specific need for legal support around their activism that isn't covered here, you can definitely reach out to us one-on-one, and we'll see what we can do. I think we're going to be reiterating this particular point here on this slide about asserting your rights and whether or not that means that they're going to be respected. So we're trying to educate people in order to be aware of what your rights are. That in itself, the law on paper isn't necessarily what's going to protect you. And so the thing that I think is most important here is for you guys to understand a general perspective of the legal landscape, and when and where the law might be a useful tool to use, but it's just one tool in your tool belts. So the next thing I just want to address is just the general range of things that we're going to be covering here. We're going to talk a little bit about campus trends, the First Amendment, free speech and academic freedom, digital security, doxing, online harassment, civil disobedience, and then how that intersects with criminal charges or student disciplinary charges, law enforcement encounters and your rights in that space. And then we're going to close out talking about anti-Palestinian racism, and specifically the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has come into play around that issue very often. If there are particular topics here where you don't think that we necessarily need to get into, for example, if people are pretty familiar with their rights in dealing with law enforcement, you can definitely share that with us in the chat, because I think if there's enough people who are like, one of these issues isn't that relevant, or one of these issues is particularly urgent, that might help us decide what to focus on, just because we do have a limited amount of time here. So definitely feel free to use the chat to give us feedback on these issues.
So some of the campus trends that we'll be addressing during this presentation include things like censorship, surveillance of groups, and infiltration. There's also disparate treatment, unequal application of the laws and procedures. There's also false accusations. So this can be like false accusations of anti-Semitism, or like false accusations of support for terrorism, things like that. Bureaucratic barriers is also something that we've been seeing on campus. So dealing with campus administration and maybe like shifting policies, and cyberbullying. So those are just some of the campus trends to keep in mind as we go through. And some tools to fight back. So beyond just legal support, some of the most effective strategies actually come from building community power and from continuing to speak out. So that looks like solidarity and collective action. It looks like boycotts, petitions, etc., taking control of the narrative, and in general, invoking our constitutional, civil, and human rights, and most importantly, self-care. And before I get into our first topic, I just want to share two things to note before the presentation, which is Number one, because the attacks are similar that we're seeing like across campuses around the country, it's really important to build on your support group. And your support group doesn't only include like your local Students for Justice in Palestine, your local organizing groups. It also involves groups nationally. So, take comfort in this and rely on one another in your communities and outside as well. And the second thing I just want to note is that the movement is winning. We are seeing such consolidated, integrated, and similar efforts that are being imposed on activists today. And that's because the movement has grown and the opposition is taking note of that and they're adjusting. So despite these efforts, Palestine is rising to the visibility of our mainstream discussions, and many are joining in this movement that we're seeing as allies and as activists. So we just want to understand that although these consequences that we're going to be talking about today are real and that they exist, it is because the movement continues to grow. So we can shift into the first topic. So as we start to talk about the First Amendment and free speech, I also want to note that we're talking about the First Amendment because suppression against Palestine activists is often tied to the First Amendment, and the right to express oneself and speak on behalf of your cause. And it's important to say just how the First Amendment demonstrates the nature and the power of the law. So the law can either be a vehicle or a tool for change, or it can be a sword. And we see that no better exemplified than in First Amendment principles with the right wing, like Nazis and white supremacists who use the First Amendment as a vehicle to spread racism and hate. And Palestine activists are relying heavily on the First Amendment to do our work. So just keep in mind the law is something that's a tool, it's not static, and it's up to how we use it and how we give power to it. And the First Amendment is it's the amendment that protects the right to freedom of religion and freedom of expression from government interference. And we want to take note of that term, government interference. Next. And also, when it comes to the First Amendment, it's important to distinguish between public universities and private universities. So, for instance, a public university, that is essentially the government, whereas private university is not. So, in a public university, the like the there's the government as the actor. So that can be like local government, municipal government. Private university can be any private actor. That can be like businesses, individuals, things like that, or a private university. A public university is limited in the ways that they can restrict speech because of the First Amendment. Um, and this doesn't mean that private universities don't have any, obligation under the First Amendment at all. But it means that, it doesn't mean you don't have rights in a private university. It's just that there are other like policies and promises that the school makes, and other principles that, you'd need to rely on to when we're talking about free speech. Next. So the First Amendment covers, it covers the way that the government and its respective actors are limiting and restricting speech. So, I want to just go through some examples of what speech would entail. So we have words, we have expressive conduct. There's wearing a message, and in the previous slide we saw someone wearing a keffiyeh. So expressive conduct would, that would be expressive conduct. So wearing a message like on a shirt, holding a sign. There's also, you keep going through them, passing out leaflets and street theater. All of these are examples of,
Lavina, do you mind
yeah.
slowing down on the slides just because I know some folks are probably taking notes.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And do you mind going back maybe about 4 slides? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem. And these are just examples of things that are speech. It's not all encompassing. They're just like some things that we often see in the movement. So expressive conduct. After that, we have wearing a message. And there's also like holding a sign, passing out leaflets as you might on campus, and street theater, in addition to boycotts. So I also want to make it clear that speech can't be restricted under the First Amendment because it's controversial or because it's uncivil. And okay. And so this means, but there can be some restrictions like time, place, and manner restrictions, which is how you might hear it being referred to. So this means that public actors can't restrict what you say, although there are some exceptions, but rather where, when, and how you say it. So this means generally you can say whatever you want. There are a few exceptions to that. And a public school can make laws prohibiting protests at midnight, for example, blocking the street or using a megaphone. They're allowed to have rules or on permits for demonstrations. But these also have to be implemented in a non-discriminatory manner. So they can't be using these restrictions for Palestine protests, for example, and then these aren't ever applied anywhere else. So, definitely keep an eye on that if you're seeing that on campus. And any regulations around time, place, and manner have to leave reasonable alternative channels to communication. So, for example, if you're trying to protest and the school says you can only protest at 7 a.m. when you know no one is going to actually see the protest, then that would be an unreasonable restriction, and that would be a violation of the First Amendment. Next. So viewpoint discrimination is if the government is restricting speech, it has to be content neutral and it can't be based on viewpoint discrimination. So they can't discriminate against speakers based on the speaker's views. So like what I was saying before about a statement being controversial or uncivil, that can't be the basis on which a statement is being restricted. And to give another example, a school can't allow like events on, let's say, Ukraine and not on Palestine, or allow students to book rooms for events on something like climate change, but then say that students can't book rooms for a Palestine event. Next. And so I'll just get into talking a little bit about First Amendment rights when it comes to public employees. So protections for the First Amendment, under the First Amendment, don't apply to speech on the job. It's only as a private citizen. So if you are speaking as a private citizen about a matter of public concern and your speech does not interfere with your job, then your speech is still protected even as a public employee. And just to give a little bit more context as to what a matter of public concern is, it's a statement related to any matter of political, social, or other concern to the community, or it could be a subject of legitimate news interest, a subject of general interest and value and concern to the public. And so employers can restrict a public employee's speech if it might interfere with the job or the government's necessary authority to manage its work. And there is a different standard, however, for faculty. And this can vary by circuit, but at least in California, there is more protection for faculty. And so it's a two-part test. It's when speaking on matters of public concern, like what I was saying earlier. And it also relates to the employee's interest in commenting upon matters of public concern. And that's being weighed against the interest of the state in promoting the efficiency of public services through its employees.
And that gets us into the realm of academic freedom. So in addition to the protections that are available under the First Amendment, of which there are some as a faculty member or as an educator, where they might not be as available to people if they have other types of public employment. The CSU's bargaining agreement, and I imagine you guys are still in the process of trying to get a new one, does specifically address the question of academic freedom. And so your union should be advocating on your behalf if you're in a situation where your academic freedom is restricted, or where you are facing any kind of restriction or punishment based off of your viewpoint or based off of your expression. So I definitely encourage people to be in regular contact with their union, and for those of you who are union stewards to definitely reach out to us if you need support when advocating for your peers around this issue of Palestine, because we can provide like resources to help explain things to administrators in this realm. And so the reference to academic freedom within the collective bargaining agreement is a little bit vague, but it does reaffirm the right to academic freedom. But you can see that there's a bit of like Weasley language that is included in there around this balancing between academic freedom and then your like responsibility as a faculty member, which I think does get us back into the realm of these impermissible restrictions that are often raised in the First Amendment space of like controversy or seeming uncivil. And I think it's very important to be very clear about the fact that even if particular speech is being characterized as uncomfortable for students. So oftentimes Zionists will make the argument that talking about Palestine is something that makes Jewish students uncomfortable. Thank you for sharing that, Dylan. I feel like it is important to advocate for the union also to be providing good representation. And if you are running into that issue, definitely reach out to us and reach out to your peers to try to draw their attention to that. But yeah, definitely reach out if that's a problem that you're running into. And so, yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I was talking about this argument around making students feel uncomfortable. When it comes to First Amendment analysis, the government has found that being confronted with uncomfortable ideas is a normal part of being a college student and part of the education process, and that is not a basis for restricting speech. And so it's really important to fully understand what the meaning of academic freedom is. And it's interesting because it kind of interplays with the First Amendment protections, whereas the restrictions on First Amendment protection limit the protection that's available while you're on the job, but then that's where academic freedom comes in. And so here's the American Association of University Professors statement on academic freedom. I know this is a lot of text on the screen, but generally speaking, what it says is that teachers are entitled to freedom in their research and in their teaching. It's not an unlimited range of freedom. It is, if you're teaching a course where there is a curriculum that is dictated by your department. So you're like, for example, a graduate student teaching a particular section and you're being told by the professor what to teach in that section, then that is something that, then that is something that becomes a question of like whether you're doing your job. If you do veer away from that, and the realm of freedom that is available in that space might be a little bit restricted. But generally speaking, as a professor who is able to dictate the content of a particular course, that should not be something that is being restricted by the university based off of its political disagreements with the content that you are teaching about. Obviously, when you're talking about a particular subject matter, so let's say you have a course on statistics, and then you are devoting a particular class session on talking about the International Court of Justice and its decision in Palestine. If it doesn't actually have a bearing on the issue of statistics, you could run into an issue there. But if you are someone who, teaches about like legal studies and you're talking about what's going on in the International Court of Justice, that would be something that should be within the realm of what you're supposed to be teaching in the classroom. And so that's what's coming up in point 2 around the controversial matter that has no relation to their subject. And that is really something that we do see Zionists pushing. But I think the other thing that's really important is here in point 3, where, just because you are a professor doesn't mean that is the sole thing that defines you. And so the school as an institution should not be restricting the speech that you're engaging in as an individual. So for example, things that you're posting on Twitter. There might be some expectations on the part of the institution that you clarify that you are, posting on your Twitter as an individual and not as a representative of the university. And those expectations, if they are being applied evenly, those disclaimers can be allowed and enforced. But if you are running into issues like that, you can definitely reach out if you feel like your rights are being infringed. I wouldn't hesitate to ask us for support if you're not totally sure that your rights are being infringed, because we can clarify that situation. And so the American Association of University Professors recently released a statement around outside speakers. I think it was an update of a previous statement talking about efforts by institutions to limit speakers being invited to I am going to back up to the question of academic freedom and students. So these principles of academic freedom, the way they're being framed here, is talking about teachers. And so there are roles that students can play as teachers in their realm. And so, for example, let's say you are giving a presentation in a class on a particular subject that you're allowed to choose as part of, within the realm of the subject of the course. If you are being restricted from choosing a particular topic that falls within that world of topics that are allowed generally, so let's say like you're in an anthropology class and you want to focus on the issue of Palestine, and they say like, no, that's too controversial. Like you can talk about any country, but not about Palestine. That would be a violation of your academic freedom as a student, but it's not generally a term that comes up, for example, when students are planning events and there's restriction that they're facing in that event planning process at a public university. That would just be a violation of their First Amendment rights to being able to, book rooms just as other students are without respect to their viewpoint. And so I think it's kind of a mushy area, but it does come up where students will have academic freedom rights that could potentially be infringed by the university. And then so when professors are inviting speakers, we have seen a big push to try to criminalize protest against speakers. And I think the American Association of University Professors does a good job of talking about the balance between the rights of people to invite speakers and the right of students to protest, because we've seen institutions really criminalizing this issue of protest at these events, and this big push to say that any kind of protest that is disruptive is something that should be punished by the institution, and that they should have ultimate control over who has a platform in these events that are being held. But when you look at what the American Association of University Professors, like really the experts on the issue of academic freedom, they say that it's important to recognize the nuance in that space, that if someone is protesting a speaker, they're not necessarily silencing them. And this makes me hopeful that if you are in a situation where your students, or if there are students here, if you are being silenced for protesting at an event and facing punishment on the part of the institution, that this would be something that you can turn to the American Association of University Professors to, intervene in. And whenever your academic freedom is being infringed, you can reach out to them to ask them to do an investigation at your university. I think the relationship the different institutions have with the AAUP varies. And so I can't guarantee that they would be able to investigate, or that the institution would take that very seriously if they do so. But it is, another advocacy group that you should reach out to if you are facing infringement on your academic freedom. And then the last thing I want to talk about before I hand it back over to Sabia is around particular Zionist tactics we see invoked to infringe on the academic freedom of faculty in California. So these are particular sections of the law that we've seen cited. So one of them is around using public resources to engage in campaign activity. And so, people say that if you are talking about Palestine, on your faculty webpage or in a space that, like the departmental webpage, or in a space that you're using like your university issued computer or something like that to engage in your activism, they will argue that that is a problematic use of public resources, or even for some people like attending academic conferences, things like that. And then another provision of the law that they talk about is the use of the Cal State name. And so they apply that both to student organizations that are using the Cal State name, or people using Cal State websites, or like departmental web pages, or mentioning that they're Cal State professors in their social media profiles. And we've seen this invoked as an argument that that the institution should be censoring the speech that they're engaging in spaces where they are identifying themselves as Cal State affiliated. What's important here is, the language of the law could potentially be read broadly in the way that Zionists are talking about it, but we don't see it being enforced in that way. And so if institutions are able to issue statements, back in 2020 in response to George Floyd protests, or statements around Ukraine, things like that, if those are things that the institution, your department, other faculty are being allowed to comment on, then they should not be restricting what you're allowed to comment on when it comes to Palestine. And so I think the most effective argument in this realm is around discriminatory application of the law. And so looking at how it's been enforced in the past, if it has been used to, if people are generally being permitted to engage in speech, then that is something that should not be restricted when you're engaging in similar activity just because of the content. So I see a question in the chat about posting flyers on campus. And so that is if other people are allowed to post flyers on campus around different issues, then you should also be allowed to post it. And when they require approval of flyers, then that is something that should be applied in a non-discriminatory manner and content neutral manner. So there can be a requirement that you comply with the approval process and that you go through those steps if they are applying that evenly to others, but they should not be rejecting a particular flyer because of its Palestine content. And definitely let me know if that's something that has happened. And then I see a question about around statements around anti-Semitic attacks and graffiti. I think one thing to keep in mind, and that's actually the next thing I have on this slide, but I'm talking about it being used in an aggressive way, just to keep in mind public record requests. So if you are a public employee, anything that you're saying using your public email or that relates to the business of the university potentially can be requested by Zionists through a public record request. And we've seen those being used in a really invasive manner. But I think like in the question that was raised in the chat around universities making statements around anti-Semitic attacks and graffiti, like it could be really interesting in that space to then make a public record request for any reports that describe what that issue is, and then other reports of attacks or vandalism that are made on campus that might show like a discriminatory approach to how the school is using its resources to issue condemnations, or how they might be misrepresenting the nature of a particular piece of graffiti. So for example, if it says from the river to the sea and they're characterizing that as anti-Semitic, I think it could be really helpful to know that with specificity that is what they're referring to and not some other like actually anti-Semitic graffiti. And then the last thing I have on this list of Zionist tactics to watch out for is doxing and harassment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about that now. I think.
Simba, may I ask a question from the chat real quick? Will these slides be made available? Or can they?
No, we're not planning to share out the slides, but since you are recording this, I think people can see the slides in the recording. But if folks need like a particular resources, definitely let us know. At the end, I have a slide around a page we have on our website with some of the relevant resources that are available. But if people have specific things that they're looking for, they can definitely reach out to us for that. So I'm going to get into the question of digital security and doxing. Okay, sorry, the animation feature did not turn out correctly. So one thing just generally to keep in mind is online security and preventing people from hacking you or getting access to particular information that you don't want to be shared out. So one thing to keep in mind is that whatever you're posting online, you should assume that it's going to be public, even if you have particular restrictions. Yeah, I think that this recording is going to be made available. And if you can address that, Rachel. And so even if you have your settings restricted to only be shared with close friends or on private, it's hard to know, like, if you might end up in a situation where someone who is following you might not necessarily be trusted or might have personal issues that come up where they might choose to screenshot something you've shared and publicize it. And so I think it's very important. And also sometimes these platforms tend to break down and people can get access to information that they thought was being posted privately. So just, I think, generally keep in mind that anything you're posting, even if you are implementing safety measures or restrictions, that potentially could be publicized. And so just being mindful. I think there's always an issue of trying to balance between the steps that you're taking to keep yourself secure and the effort that goes into that, and the way that it limits your audience with your efforts to try to get your message out there. And I think for everyone, they have to pick an approach that I think is the most effective. I know, like, for example, using something like Signal might mean that you have a more limited audience than if you're using like regular text messages or WhatsApp or some other platform that people are more readily on. But there are benefits to using something with end-to-end encryption that is open source, that you're able to really know is actually encrypting your materials. Whereas, like, if you're using iMessage, Apple could get a request from law enforcement to turn over your data, even though they say it's encrypted. If they have the keys to that encryption, if it's not end to end, that could potentially be turned over. And so I think it's really important to really strike that balance and to look to experts for information about that. There's a couple of websites that we have listed here, the Surveillance Self-Defense from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then Equality Lab's Guide to Digital Security. We'll have more information about different tools that you can use and things that you should watch out for. And then the one point I do want to emphasize here is when you're engaging in organizing that is not related to your work, then it is helpful to use off-campus email, just because there might be public record requests and things like that, to really, like, divide your organizing work from your professional work. Or for students to also be using off-campus email addresses for their organizing, just because institutions can sometimes get access to their student email addresses as well. In the public university space, there should be like First Amendment protections for the students. But sometimes when you're signing up for the email program, they might say, like, oh, you don't have any kind of like expectation of privacy. And so kind of muddying the waters around whether there are legal protections there. Next thing I want to talk about is just generally speaking, there might not be a lot of resources that are available when people are being attacked by sites like Canary Mission or Stop Anti-Semitism. But one thing that's always available to you is to balance out the attacks with positive content. And so, making sure that if you are under attack, that doesn't actually silence you, because then that can create a situation where the narrative is entirely being controlled by the people who are trying to misrepresent your views. And so continuing to speak out, trying to, publish articles talking about your views and things like that can, at least for someone who is coming at this from a fair-minded approach, be helpful in helping them really understand what is going on and really discrediting those harassment websites. The other thing I just would generally encourage you to do is to keep in mind ways that you can use your institution to platform, particularly students who are under attack. So we've seen students who are profiled on Canary Mission turn to their administrations and to ask them, can you post like an alumni spotlight or a student spotlight about me on your website to kind of help mitigate that? Because maybe like a Cal State Northridge website might end up higher in Google search results than Canary Mission, because it's viewed as a more reputable page. And coming from an official source, would allow space for the student to talk about themselves from their own perspective instead of the perspective of their detractors. And so if you are in a space where you can, share student content, I think obviously like within the bounds of your scholarship and your any kind of rules around that, and not necessarily like engaging in a discriminatory approach of like prioritizing particular students' voices, but just keeping in mind like what kind of resources that might be available to you to help students who are being attacked, or to ask your administration to help those students. But the one thing to keep in mind as well is that a lot of these attacks are going to be posted on social media sites like Twitter and Instagram, and if you report this content, that could result in these things being taken down, as well as on Google as well. Like when the search results come up, there are certain reporting mechanisms that even if they're not effective in getting your content, the content that's attacking you, taken down, it could be effective in building the case that a particular website should be deprioritized in Google platforms. So people are engaging in direct advocacy with these platforms, but the more evidence that is there of problematic content, for example, coming from Stop Anti-Semitism or Canary Mission that's being reported, the more likely these platforms are potentially to take it seriously. Alrighty. So I'm going to talk a little bit about doxing and online blacklists. I think the text on here isn't super visible, but I just wanted to make it clear that when people are getting profiled on an anti-Palestinian website like Canary Mission, the harms that they can suffer can, in a sense, depend on the content that they're posting. And so I think like, there was this individual who posted some content that I'm assuming they were very young when they posted this, but, using a racial slur, showing like something, weaponry and violence. And I think when someone looks at a page like this, they might, take away, like this might be the most controversial content that this person posted, and having all that collected in one place might make them seem like someone who has, questionable values and things like that. But, even though that selective presentation of this person's views is what's causing that perception, it also, just having this content out there does potentially create the grounds for that manipulation to be taking place. And so I just encourage everyone to be mindful of all the content that they have on the internet, like especially for people who have been connected to the internet since they were, preteens, who might not even be aware of some of the websites where they have accounts and the things that they may have posted. Anything that's out there that is attached to your name, people can assume is still representative of your views, even though it's really out of date. And so just going through and Googling yourself and seeing what might come up, I think is really helpful in really giving you a chance to control the narrative before you're under attack. Because if you have a website that's just like talking about like your Palestine activism, if someone looks at this, they might say, oh, okay, this is like, this person is violent, or supports terrorism. But then if you actually read the text of it, like even a site like Canary Mission can't represent righteous activism as something that is problematic for anyone who's looking at it from a reasonable freedom of mind. And so like, it results in a site like Canary Mission, like posting an image that says free our beloved Rasmia now, even when they're trying to engage in a smear campaign. It just like, what can they say when all this says is free our beloved Rasmia now? So I think there's just like steps that people can take. I'm not like trying to engage in like victim blaming, but just people being mindful about what's out there when they've been on the internet for a really long time. And then the other thing, in terms of like the content that is out there about you, you might not be aware of the way different like breadcrumbs might add up together. So if you're using like a particular username on a website, you also use that in a different website. And then there might be some information that you've posted where it's, putting your phone number out there. The phone number can be connected to a different profile that has your actual name. And then data broker websites, I'm sorry, this image is cut off, but data broker websites might have your information out there where they can take your name and find your address, or relatives who have the same last name as you if your name is pretty unique. And so, even when you think you're being anonymous online, that can be used to connect people to your identity because of individual pieces of information that you've posted online. So, I looked myself up and it had a bunch of different cities that I had lived in, names of relatives, contact information. With these data broker websites, they will always have an opt-out policy. And I think particularly for people in California, there are specific laws that require them to remove your information when you're making a request. But generally, that is also required in a lot of different places and is generally available to people for websites like Spokeo or whitepages.com to make those requests and get that information taken down. I always recommend people do this before they're under attack if they're able to, because that way the information's not being like screenshotted and shared out. Oh, sorry, here's the same thing that I had cut off in the other page. There are particular websites that are targeting people based off of their LinkedIn posts. And so I would encourage you all to, for tenured faculty, for example, you might be in a safe space, but for someone who is an adjunct or for someone who, for just like students, when you're posting where you work, that makes it easier for Zionists to contact that particular employer to target you. And so, while a website like Canary Mission is really harmful on its own for anyone who's Googling you and finds that in your search results, them proactively reaching out to your employer puts you at much more risk than just the mere existence of the website. And so, just being mindful of what kind of information you're sharing. And I would encourage people, particularly in this moment where there's these websites being created like anti-israelemployees.com, to not necessarily share the names of their current employers. And then the other thing I just want to mention, even when people are posting anonymously online, there are facial recognition websites that, like, I took a picture of myself and I put it in and it gave me a bunch of different websites that my face appears on. And so just being mindful that, like, if you're out there at a protest and someone takes a photo of you, if these websites have your face on there, that is a way that Zionists are able to trace that back. I do not know, I don't have a list of all these facial recognition websites, but similar to websites like Spokeo and whitepages.com, they will take down your information if you ask them to. Some of them require you to post your driver's license, for example, when trying to take down that information. And so there might be things that feel risky to engage in order to get the information taken down. And so just looking out for expert guidance on this issue, I think is really helpful. So there are these guides online. So for example, the PEN America Online Harassment Field Manual or the Equality Labs Anti-Doxing Guide for Activists are very useful tools for figuring out how to get your information taken down from these websites. I am not familiar with legal insurance, and so that's not something I can comment on personally. Sorry about that. And then just a couple of things I just wanted to mention is one thing we've seen is doxing taking place offline. And so there's been trucks that come up with photos of people with smears against them at different universities, and some of them targeting people at home. And so, for example, for students who have their information on file with their university, there's particular types of information like directory information that the university might disclose despite federal privacy laws, because there are carve-outs. And one of those pieces of information might be your home address and your contact information. And so just being mindful and checking in with the registrar for students about placing restrictions on the information they disclose, because I do suspect it's either from these white pages websites or maybe directly from the institution that the Zionists are getting the locations to send these trucks to scare people. But obviously, we also see them around particular campuses. But I encourage people to be mindful of what information the institution is sharing about you. With these trucks, when they are off campus, if they are engaging in smear campaigns like calling someone anti-Semitic, the legal options might be limited. So some of the claims that we've seen being made is sometimes people are being a photo is being put up of one person with someone else's name. And so that's just straight up false information. Or someone is being accused of being a member of a particular club that they're not actually members of. And so that could be false information that would allow people to take legal action to say, like, this is defamatory. When they're calling someone an anti-Semite and just posting a photo of them, or attributing their membership to like a Students for Justice in Palestine club, that on its own doesn't necessarily have a lot of recourse available. So if you're sharing true information, that's not something that courts are going to restrict. And calling someone an anti-Semite is viewed as a matter of opinion and not necessarily as like a factual question that could be restricted. And so what we encourage people to do is to contact administrators for support around this issue, so they can ask administrations to issue statements condemning a particular action, or amplifying a particular person's voice, asking them to take down information that's on the website. So for faculty who have their office location or phone number available, if they're facing these attacks, they could ask to have that information taken down, or to have their classes moved, to ask for support in physical security on campus. We've had people ask their administrations to provide them a subscription to websites to scrub this information off the internet so they don't have to make those specific requests. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also very helpful to continue speaking out, because if you do silence yourself, that does tell Zionists that they've won and encourage them to engage in more attacks. And you can also reach out to us for support, so we can explore whether there might be legal options in a particular situation, and provide you with digital security resources. And we can also help you potentially with public messaging around this issue, and if you can't decide whether it is something that you want to speak out about. Okay, and the last thing I just want to mention, if people are facing censorship on social media, hacking, things like that, we encourage them to contact Hamle, which is a Palestinian digital rights organization that has direct connections with social media platforms. They will report the complaints that come to them and try to advocate for people's accounts to be restored and things like that. But then they also just have like a broad-based overview of these attacks. And so generally speaking, if you're facing social media censorship or hacking, this is not something that we will engage in ourselves, but we will refer you out to Hamna for that. So we encourage you to go to them. The website is spelled with a 7, so 7or.7amleh.org. Is their reporting form. It might show up in Arabic when you initially go there, but there should be an E at the top of the page that you can click on to switch that over to English, so you can make a report there if you don't speak Arabic. Okay, handing it over to Sabia.
So I just want to give an overview of civil disobedience. This is the next section we want to talk about. So civil disobedience is when you are breaking the law to make a political point. And it's either because the law itself is unjust, or because breaking it will help to get your message across. So this applies to breaking minor laws. It's when you're aware that you're breaking the law and you're facing arrest. You're like doing something disruptive to the free flow of commerce, because you're trying to make a political point, that this issue that you're advocating for is an emergency and it can't go on. So we at Paralegal can't provide advice about how to do civil disobedience, but we can provide information on the consequences of carrying out a civil disobedience action. So a few pointers that we have for you when engaging in a civil disobedience action is to call your local National Lawyers Guild chapter and recruit legal observers for your event, so that they can send over some legal observers and they will be there at your event to take note of what they see, like things like if police officers and how they're interacting with protesters. If they get violent with protesters, the legal observers will be there as a third party to observe and to take note of what they see. And also have the National Lawyers Guild hotline ready, like their phone number. You can write that number down on your arm if needed, like when you're going into a civil disobedience action. And also having a criminal defense attorney on backup so that you're able to call that attorney if and when you get arrested. So you can speak with that attorney about the specific consequences of breaking a law. And it's also important to remember that if you get arrested, everything on you can be searched. So that is something to take note of when deciding like what you are going to have on you when you're going to one of these actions. If if there's something you don't want to be searched, you shouldn't have it on you when you're participating in one of these actions. And state laws are different. Prosecutors can bring in different kinds of charges. Um, Another thing to be aware of is just power dynamics when you're in a situation like that. The unfortunate reality is that police respond differently to people of color, to undocumented folks, and people risking arrests should, in general, know your basic rights when it comes to the police, which we will get into in a few slides. And so I'll head back to you.
Sorry, one more slide for you, I think.
Oh, right. Okay. So these are just two different columns. So what you can do and what Palestine Legal can do. So as I mentioned, what you can do is calling NLG beforehand, that's National Lawyers Guild, getting legal observers, also knowing your school and city and local policies. So that way when you're going into an event, like, is my participation in this event breaking a school policy? Is it breaking like a local rule? And then watch out for changing policies. So if you notice that your school had a certain set of policies before, but since Palestine protests have ramped up on campus, they changed their policies to be something else, then that's something to be aware of for, disparate treatment of how they're responding to Palestine protests versus events in the past. And like the next point is looking out for differential treatment. So it kind of relates to that, or in general, how they respond to a Palestine protest versus how they're responding to other protests. And documenting everything. So just having the legal observers on hand to document what they see, but also yourself documenting what you are engaging in, what you're seeing around you. If there's different kinds of incidents on campus that you're noticing of like discrimination, having that on hand, documenting like when it happened, who was involved, what the school's response was, different, and was it reported to the school, different things like that. And building relationships with faculty. So this is like a note for students, having allies amongst faculty can be really helpful. For example, like if you get into trouble and you're facing student conduct charges, it can be helpful to have faculty on your side to help with advocating with the university for your rights and for you to be treated fairly, especially if the school is not doing that. And in general, having an advocacy strategy, before you engage in an active civil disobedience. And what Palestine Legal can do. So if you have questions, you can reach out to us to help, so that we can help you understand like local laws and school policies. You can get in touch with your local National Lawyers Guild or criminal defense attorney. We do represent students in disciplinary proceedings if needed. And we can also help you with just messaging around how you want to word what you're trying to say.
And potentially amplifying your experiences ourselves. So I just want to get in a little into what a legal observer is. And so the legal observer program is something that's run by the National Lawyers Guild, which is a collective of leftist attorneys. The legal observer program, lots of people who are legal observers are not attorneys. I would guess maybe they're mostly not attorneys, but they are people who are interested in helping advocate for progressive causes. And so the role of a legal observer is to watch and document particularly problematic behavior by the opposition or by police. So they will be people who are volunteers who are working with a local chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, which you can ask them to come attend and be present at your action, but they won't be involved in what's going on. And so if you know, these legal observers with the green hats are trained by the National Lawyers Guild, but they might not always be available for a particular action. So particularly if students are like tabling on campus and are facing a lot of harassment there, it might not be possible to get a volunteer legal observer available to be present at this table. But students and faculty can themselves be acting as legal observers if they just keep in mind some particular principles. So one of them is not being involved in the action itself. So if you are attending a protest as a protester, or if you're someone who is currently being targeted in a particular disciplinary hearing, acting as an observer at that hearing is not going to be as effective as if you're someone who is playing a more neutral role there. Because you might be a witness of something that has taken place, but there might be accusations that you have a biased perspective because you were participating in the action yourself. And so, it can be a helpful way of incorporating people who might not necessarily be comfortable participating in a protest and speaking out, or like, chanting around a particular issue, but they might be willing to just like show up and to act as support in observing how the campus is responding to a particular protest or how police are responding. There might be pros and cons to recording a particular action. We encourage people, if they are recording, to point their cameras at administrators or at the opposition or at police, rather than recording the actions of the protesters, just in case that information is, subpoenaed by law enforcement and could put people at risk. If there's a situation where people might be potentially arrested, I mean, obviously it's better to have trained legal observers there. But if you are just acting as a legal observer, just, in this emergency situation, or when there might not be others who are available, the things that are important are to find out the person who is being taken into custody. So if they're willing to just shout their name, you can write that down. And then find out who is the officer, like ask for their badge number. And if you can also ask them where that person is being taken, that could be helpful to have that information for supporters in the community that are going to be trying to get them out of custody if they are being taken into custody. It's good to track down witnesses that might be available in addition to you, particularly if something problematic takes place. I don't think you necessarily need to try to find witnesses if nothing problematic is taking place, but just to have contact information for additional people that could be called to testify in support of a student who's facing conduct charges, or someone who's facing legal charges in court, to have witnesses to counteract the narrative that Zionists are pushing about what took place. So the types of things that people should be paying attention to are unwanted touching or physical threats, harassing language. So just like making a note of that if you have like a notebook, or if you're taking notes in a note app on your phone. Administrators treating students differently, and then just like censorship that's taking place, people being told you can't like have this particular sign up where other people are allowed to have particular signs up. So I already mentioned that people who are acting as observers should not be personally taking part in the action, but they also shouldn't be playing like a double role of being like a media spokesperson or negotiating with police and things like that. It's important for people to have people playing these roles in certain actions. So people might have like a law enforcement liaison as part of their protest security. They might have spokespeople. It's better for these people not to be playing the role of the observer, in addition to those particular roles, just because that creates a situation where they're being viewed as having a particular bias. And also does run into a risk of, maybe you're like trying to help students on campus with an action by acting as an observer. If you're playing the role of like negotiating with the administration on their behalf, if they've asked you to do that, that could be very helpful. And maybe administrators will take you more seriously than they would students. But if they haven't asked you that, I think just like being mindful of the power dynamics of, maybe you might encourage students to step back from like a high risk action, whereas like that might not necessarily be the role that they want you to play in a particular situation. And so just like being mindful of when you're being supportive and when you might be directive in a particular situation. So some steps that you might want to take if there is civil disobedience that you've engaged in, if you're facing discriminatory treatment or like physical attacks, to try to draw attention to that situation, and reach out to media. If you need support with that, definitely let us know. Encouraging supportive faculty or the general public to engage in a petition or a call-in campaign. One thing I would recommend, if you have a choice between a petition versus a call-in campaign, it can be helpful to have a call-in campaign, because we've seen administrations like literally count up the number of views a particular video gets or a number of calls that they get, number of emails, and really like weigh in like, oh, these people are saying to cancel this class and this many people are saying to keep it. And that can have an impact on their decision making. The other thing that can be really powerful is solidarity actions. One recent case that we saw in the media were students that were facing criminal charges for creating, being accused of creating a parody newspaper of a newspaper in I want to say at Northwestern University, and they were facing criminal charges over that. But the response that came from campus was that, faculty, student organizations, other students on campus were saying, we're not going to speak to reporters at this paper. We're not going to like help them do their reporting at all until these charges are dropped. And the editors of the paper spoke out against it, and then their ownership also dropped the charges. And so they were able to get these criminal charges dropped by saying that they're going to stand in solidarity with these students and not lend their labor, lend their voice to the school paper until they drop the charges. The next thing I want to talk about is law enforcement encounters. And so your rights when dealing with law enforcement will vary depending on whether you're at home and encountering them outside your home, or if you encounter them at the street. So I'm going to start off with your rights with law enforcement at the door. One thing that we have seen is an uptick of people contacting the FBI. And we've seen, announcements from the federal government about law enforcement responses to student and faculty activism. And so this is something that, has been threatened, that we have seen happening. It is meant to scare people away from activism, and I don't think it should. But it is important for people to be aware of their rights in this space, in order to mitigate any harms that they might experience. I think there actually was an announcement from the FBI saying they're not targeting people for First Amendment protected activities. So they are claiming that this is not happening, but we've seen people getting questioned about social media posts in particular. And so that is something to just be aware of, and to not only, educate yourself about your rights, but to also educate anyone who might be in your home, to educate your friends, because we have seen in one case, FBI contacting the friends of an individual. And so if there are police at the door, we would encourage people, we had this skip, I'm going to skip over it in the interest of time, but to not answer the door, not to talk to them without a lawyer, and to just ask them to leave their card, and that you'll have your attorney contact them. If you don't have an attorney, you can always contact us. We might be able to support you ourselves or connect you with someone else who can support you. But we always encourage people to have a lawyer speak to law enforcement on their behalf rather than speaking directly. They might just be coming on a fishing expedition, trying to gather information to target your community. They might be just engaging in intimidation tactics, because if they show up at your door, you might be less likely to post things that are controversial and draw attention to the institution. So just don't talk to them. You're never required to talk to them. But it's also important not to invite them in. So sometimes you might open the door not realizing who it is. And if you see that it is, police or the FBI, you're free to just like close the door. You're free to go outside and close the door behind you. But once you do, let them into your home, they can look around, and whatever they're seeing might be something that they can take action on. If they see something that might be illegal that they might want to investigate further, they can say, we, had your consent to be searching your home because you invited us into that space, and whatever we could see, we could see. And so you should never invite them in. Your loved ones, your roommates, no one should be inviting them in, because whoever is able to answer the door and seem like they're in a position to invite people in could potentially be giving them consent to enter your home. But the home is like viewed in the law as being a very sacred space that police should not be entering without your consent. But there's this implied consent that happens when you invite them in. We also encourage people not to lie when speaking with law enforcement. So they can lie to you all they want, but it can be a crime to lie to law enforcement, particularly if they can characterize it as interfering with an investigation. So if police do show up at your door, tell them you don't want to talk to them, tell them to leave a card and your attorney will follow up with them. If they have a warrant, they do have a right to enter your home. And so the things that a warrant needs to include are the specific location where you're at, the things that they are searching for, and a signature from a judge. And so if they say they have a warrant, if you have like a window next to the door, they could hold it up to the window and you can see if those particular items are present. Or you can ask them to like hand it to you through like a crack in the door or slide it underneath the door for you to actually see what is on that paper, because sometimes there might be particular papers that are issued. We saw this happen a few years ago with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, where ICE would show up with something that they were claiming was a warrant, but it was just like a document that was issued by ICE just to get into someone's home and try to search for people to target. And so just like making sure that when they say it's a warrant, that it actually is a warrant, that it has those particular items listed there. And then, so if you encounter law enforcement on the street, there are a few different postures that you might encounter them in. So one is a consensual encounter, which is where police will just come up to you and talk to you. They don't have to have any kind of suspicion. They can just start asking you questions. You don't have to answer any of their questions. You don't have to stay there and talk to them because they have no basis for stopping you. And so if you do run into police and they start talking to you, the first thing to figure out is whether this is a consensual encounter where, you know, they're not necessarily getting your consent to talk to you, but there is an implied consent as long as you don't walk away from them. And so you can just ask them, if you are in the situation, if you are free to leave, or if you're being detained. And wow, this is a hard to read slide, sorry. So the like magic words in that situation are to ask if you're being detained or if you're free to leave. And you know, if it is just a consensual encounter, then they will say yes, and you can just walk away. In California, you are not required to provide ID to police if they ask you to identify yourself. The exception to that situation is if you are being pulled over when you're driving, they are allowed to ask for your driver's license to know whether you have a driver's license. And then the other situation where you might want to provide ID might be in a situation where you're encounter law enforcement like at a protest. They believe that you've like done something that is a violation of the law and they're trying to write you a ticket. So under California law, if you are getting stopped for a misdemeanor, so like a lower level offense, and it is not something that is a crime of violence, generally speaking, misdemeanors that are nonviolent are things that police should be giving you a citation for and not taking you into custody. But they might not be willing to give you a citation if they don't know who you are. And so identifying yourself in that situation might be the difference between them giving you a ticket to show up in court on a particular day versus them taking you to a police station to be booked and to be able to identify you. And so it's really a question of on your own to decide whether or not this is something that you do want to provide them as a matter of your own convenience to not be taken into custody in that situation. The next type of encounter I want to talk about is like a higher level interaction with police, and that is a detention. So in order for police to be able to detain you, they have to believe that there has been a crime that occurred and that you have some connection to that crime. And it is a reasonable suspicion. It's not like they don't have to be certain that it's you, but for example, let's say they say that there was a break-in and someone was wearing a red shirt and you have a red shirt on, that might be a basis for them to think that that might have been you because you match the description of the person who engaged in that break-in. So a detention is also called a stop and frisk. And it is a situation where you're being stopped by police for a limited amount of time. Like you're not being taken into custody, taken to the police station, anything like that. And they are just asking you some questions to clarify the situation. And so if you are being detained, police can pat you down for weapons, but they are not allowed to search you just to try to find like if you have anything on you that could be evidence of a crime. And so if you are being stopped and it is a detention, like they will tell you you're being detained, that you're not free to leave if you ask them. Like they don't necessarily have to proactively say that unless you ask them. But it's important to also tell them that you're not consenting to a search. And so if they pat you down and they are looking for like if you have a pocket knife and then they feel something in your pocket that might be like a weapon, then they can actually take out what's in your pocket to take a look at that. And if that turns out to be like evidence of a particular crime, then they are allowed to take that into custody. I mean, they like that is evidence that they've legally obtained because they thought it might have been a weapon, but they shouldn't generally be going into your pockets, searching your backpack, things like that, just to see if they can find evidence of a crime. So it's just important to be clear that you're not consenting to a search. The last type of encounter is an arrest. And so for an arrest, they have to have a higher level of suspicion, which is called probable cause, that you have committed a crime. And so if you are being arrested, the thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't talk to them without an attorney. So just invoking your right to remain silent and saying that you would like to speak to an attorney. No matter how many questions they ask you, you should just continue to invoke that right. In order to, not be put in a situation where police are engaging in a fishing expedition or where you might be sharing information that you think is accurate that might turn out to be inaccurate and where you might be accused of lying or obstructing justice or things like that. There's really no benefit to talking to police without an attorney present. And so you should just continue to invoke your right to remain silent. People, like if you are taken into custody, they're allowed to search you, they're allowed to take your belongings. There are a lot more rights that police have when they can say that they have a good reason to believe that you've committed a crime. And so it really depends on their level of suspicion. If they've actually witnessed the crime themselves, or if they have a warrant from a judge signing off on your arrest. So those are police interactions. It's useful to be aware of your rights with law enforcement, but it is important to be mindful of the difference between having particular rights and being able to protect yourself from police violating those rights. And so just keeping in mind that like you can assert that like you don't consent to a search, but they might still search you. And resisting that physically like might result in them engaging in physical harm. And so just really being aware of the risks that you face in a particular situation. And these are rights that you could potentially enforce afterwards. And it's helpful if you can document what's going on, if there's people around who can record what's going on. That can be helpful. But just, yeah, keeping in mind that like police will not necessarily respect your rights and they might get violent with you, and just keeping in mind how to, what your priorities are and what you're trying to protect in that moment. Yeah, sorry, police are scary. I think that's it for me. I'm gonna pass that over to Sabia.
So this is going to be the last like big section of our presentation. And we'll be talking about anti-Palestinian racism next. So anti-Palestinian racism is what you might have expected. It's this discrimination or harassment against Palestinians or also people who are perceived to be Palestinian. Next. And so why does APR or anti-Palestinian racism matter? It matters because Palestinians and also their allies should be able to advocate for Palestine without fear of discrimination. Next. And so when we're talking about anti-Palestinian racism or APR, as I'll refer to it on campus, we're talking also about how that plays with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is a federal anti-discrimination law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin at institutions that receive federal funding. So there's two ways that a school can violate Title VI. One is if it commits a discriminatory act on its own, and also if it permits a hostile environment on campus. And just to know about Title VI, so this is one way that public and private schools can be held accountable as long as they're a school receiving federal funding. And there's also two ways to enforce Title VI. So one is via a private lawsuit, and the other is a complaint to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And there is a 180-day deadline for that. So 180 days from, I think it's, and Zoho, correct me if I'm wrong, like from when the incident occurred. So 180 days from then. So when it comes to documenting APR, it's really important to document everything, because if you're going to end up submitting, like filing a lawsuit or submitting a complaint to the Department of Education, you want the incidents that you report to be as specific as possible. So you want to save evidence also in case, if they open an investigation and they have questions, you want to be able to answer and provide evidence for the statements that you're making. So that includes, saving evidence. So if this is in the form of an email or video or pictures that you have, taking screenshots, for example, of like messages that you're getting on social media, noting relevant information, like who was involved, what exactly happened, where it was, when it was, who you reported it to, if there was any response from the reporting, and then any witnesses. And then it also can be important to compare the treatment of two similarly situated people. So this is kind of like what we were talking about earlier about if the school is treating a different group of people differently than how they're treating those who are Palestinian, for example. So these are just some examples of how a school could be treating like speech around Palestine differently, or like just Palestinian students and how they show their support for Palestinian students versus others. So this is an example of Georgetown's statement for Ukraine. And this is an example of Georgetown's statement for Palestine. Another example of Columbia. So Columbia statement for Ukraine, down below there on the screen. And then for Palestine, you can see that there, where Palestine is not even mentioned. So these are some examples here about Legal's Title VI complaints that we have filed. So this one is from Florida State University. A student named Ahmed was he's a Palestinian, he was a Palestinian American student at FSU, who had spent a lot of his childhood in the West Bank. And so what happened with Ahmed was there was a photo of him that got circulated where he was expressing outrage at Israel and the occupation. It ended up making the rounds, and legislators got a hold of it, and there was a statewide campaign against Ahmed, threatening to withhold funds to FSU if the Student Senate didn't remove him from his position. And that was the big controversy here, was that he was the first Palestinian American Senate president. And so legislators and others involved in this campaign wanted to get him removed from that position. And, the FSU administration, their response was not to protect Ahmed. It was rather adding fuel to the fire, condemning him for quote unquote anti-Semitic remarks. So this is just an example of like a situation where you can clearly see anti-Palestinian racism on campus, and where the school did not protect the student. Rather, they contributed directly to the discrimination, and they allowed this environment to persist.
In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the next couple.
So just some more pointers for Title VI complaint. So when things that you should do, you should contact administration when it comes to like instances of anti-Palestinian racism. Make sure you document everything, compare experiences with other orgs to show that there's disparate treatment. Seek support from your community, from faculty, and also legal support. And, you can also utilize a publicity campaign to draw attention to what's going on. And then also call us. And these are some of the things on the right-hand side that Palestine Legal can help with. So we can help to analyze the facts and walk you through what the relevant laws and policies are. We may be able to help send a legal letter to the school's administration, just help you navigate communications with the school, and amplify your demands through our partners, and also like help you with public messaging and connect you with others who've had similar experiences. And so when it comes to these kinds of complaints that I was talking about with Title VI, so no complaints about pro-Palestinian speech on campus creating a hostile environment for Jewish students have been found to have legal merit. But these sorts of complaints, we have seen them being pursued. So what's happening is that anti-Palestinian groups are working to equate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, so to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and also lobbying to have a distorted Israel-centered definition of anti-Semitism adopted into law and used as a censorship tool by media. And you may have heard of this before, the definition, but it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition, or IRA, which you can see that's the abbreviation on this slide. And so in 2019, Donald Trump issued an executive order requiring federal civil rights investigators to consider this IRA definition of anti-Semitism when evaluating Title VI complaints. And so this kicked off just a whole new round of Title VI complaints. And again, it's important to note that none of them have resulted in any findings against universities. And with this IRA definition, there's 11 different components, or 11 different contemporary examples that they gave of anti-Semitism, and 7 of them are focused on Israel. And among these examples they give are applying double standards to Israel, or claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So they're saying that that is anti-Semitism. So again, when documenting things, who is involved, when, where, and what. And yeah, this is just a slide kind of summarizing, writing it down, putting it in your notes, sending an email to yourself using a Google or Excel sheet, or even more securely, you can use something like CryptPad, taking pictures and videos and getting a legal observer from NLG. Yeah, and this is like a sample chart you can use. And more resources on our website, and Zoe, you can talk about that.
Yeah, so we do have a page on our website. If you go to our homepage, there is a link there to a blog post where we collected some resources to help people navigate this particular moment. We need to add more resources that have been developed recently, but this might be a good place to start if you're looking for information on some of the things that we've talked about. But you can obviously reach out to us as well through our website. We have a particular form for requests for legal support on the intake page. It'll say get help at the top of the page, and you can click that. Or you can also contact us with like more general inquiries where you're not asking for legal support. I know one thing that had been requested as part of the session was to help around messaging and what to say. So I think, that might vary depending on the situation if people have particular questions about that they want to raise in the chat or in the Q&A. But I do want to just like make a plug for this particular resource. It's called The Heart of It, Messaging for the Palestinian Freedom Movement. And it talks about some of the like messaging pitfalls and just ways in which we talk about this issue that may or may not resonate with people. As you can see, it's from 2019 in this URL here, but so it's not necessarily around what's happening right in this moment, but it is helpful to think about like, when you're talking about occupation, like people might think you're talking about jobs, or when you're talking about settlements, like they might not realize what you mean when you're talking about illegal Israeli settlements. And so I think it's a really helpful resource. And thank you for sharing a link to it. So I encourage people to look to that for help on figuring out how to talk about this issue in a way that really resonates with people in a values-driven manner. But I think that is it for our formal presentation. Here is our website and our social media handle. But I'm gonna stop the screen share.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Sabia. I'm gonna stop recording and we will move on to the Q&A part of our session. Just do a time check. It's 1:36 and we're stopping it around 2. So I'll go ahead and stop recording. Thank you again.